Hello and welcome to Waterford Writers Weekend. Welcome to our first live Zoom event for the festival. It is 12 p.m. here in Ireland, but it is a very early 7 a.m. in Washington, and I am delighted to welcome Ambassador Daniel Mulhall to join me. We will be talking about poetry in a format that might be familiar to some of you because it borrows heavily from a certain BBC Radio 4 programme. Daniel is a native Waterford man, and he is currently the Irish ambassador to America. He currently posted in Washington, originally from Waterford, obviously, a graduate of UCC like myself. He has been the Irish ambassador in Malaysia, Germany, and the UK. He is a published author, the honorary president of the Yeats Society, and a prolific social media user, it has to be said, using it to connect his followers to his own role, but also to his interest in literature and culture, and underlines that. It is very early in Washington, Ambassador, so I'm delighted for you to join us. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It is an early start, all right. It's still dark outside, so forgive me if I'm not at my best.
No, well, plenty of coffee, I always feel, is a good thing to do.
Right.
So welcome. We're so delighted to have you join us. This is our first, albeit virtually, for Waterford Writers Weekend 2020. This is the first Zoom live broadcast. So we are praying to the internet gods and the connection gods that everything will go well and we will stay connected for the next 45 minutes or so. And as I said, today we're doing a desert island poems that borrows heavily from a certain program on BBC Radio 4, but we're going to be talking about your favorite poems, or some of your favorite poems that you have selected. And I suppose one of the reasons, to give context as to why this conversation was prompted, was because, like, as I said, you are a prolific Twitter user and have used it to connect to literature and culture. Can you tell us a little bit more about that before we move on to the poetry?
Sure, yeah. It started in, I started using Twitter in 2013 when I was in Germany. And I sort of realized it had a potential for a diplomat to speak to people, you know, that might be interested in Ireland and to connect us with people in Germany. So I tweeted in German and English when I was in Germany. And at that time, I mainly tweeted about the Irish economy and so forth. But then it occurred to me that Twitter could be a very good medium for literature, and particularly for poetry, because of course you can squeeze some significant lines of verse into a tweet, especially now that you have the 240 characters. It's about 6 lines of poetry. So what happened was 2015 came around. I was in London and I was very keen to promote the 150th anniversary of the birth of W.B. Yeats. So I gave about 20 lectures all over Britain at the Edinburgh Book Festival, the Oxford Literary Festival, the Newbury Festival, and so on. And I decided at the beginning of the year that one of the things I could do to mark my enthusiasm for Yeats and to draw attention to the anniversary of his birth would be to tweet a daily quote from Yeats. So for the whole year, every day, and some days like National Poetry Day or his birthday or the anniversary of his death, I would maybe tweet a dozen times snippets of poetry from Yeats. And it was extremely popular. I got very good response to it. And it immediately occurred to me, hey, Twitter is ideal for poetry. So towards the end of the year, I was planning to give up this practice because there was a certain amount of effort going into it. You had to sort of sit down at night and after a long day and find a little quote and then put it out there the following morning. And so it was a certain amount of effort involved. But I kept getting people coming to me and saying, you have to keep this going. You must keep it going. So I hit upon the idea that I would not just tweet Yeats, but I would tweet from Irish poets generally. So I have tweeted everything from a translation of a medieval monk's poem in Irish, on Pango Bawn, for example. I've done translations of that. I put them out there on Twitter, and I've gone up as far as writers like Jessica Traynor, Sean Sexton, Colin Keegan, who I think is part of the festival this weekend.
Yeah,
so I've tried to cover the whole range of Irish poetry from the very beginnings to contemporary, younger contemporary poets, and it's had an enormously positive response. I mean, some people tell me that it's their favorite thing on Twitter every day, that they get up in the morning and they read my tweet and they really enjoy, and it sets them up for the day. I see it as a kind of thought for the day, putting something out there that may make people think. And during the pandemic, in March, April, I started to tweet a daily reading of Irish poetry. And that also, I mean, some of my readings attracted 10, 15,000 views, which is enormous for someone like me. So that again proved to me that particularly in times of trouble, people turn to poetry. And actually now that Ireland's gone back to, I was gone up to level 5, I think I might resume my readings. I stopped them for a few months because, you know, things went back more to normal, and I felt that I could safely stop doing my daily poetry readings. But I think I might resume them now that there's been a return to level 5, and I hope that people at home will take some comfort and inspiration from the poems I'm able to put out there on a daily basis.
And I definitely found that myself. I would look forward to seeing, particularly in lockdown, you know, and I suppose because Twitter, I use Twitter myself a lot, but I suppose it was a great distraction from, you know, what was going on around us. And I do find that poetry as well, it has that immediacy. I find that particularly during lockdown, less so over the summer when we were coming out of it or in September, but my ability to concentrate on great tomes of work, if you like, because I am a voracious reader myself, like yourself, was lessened. And I think poetry has become easier for me to consume because it's a less of a commitment, if you like, and really hits to the point. And a lot of the time I found when I was looking at your tweets, I would find new things, and we'll discuss that in a bit, but I would also remember poems that I had forgotten about and go, oh God, yeah, that was a great poem, I remember, and go back and revisit poets that maybe I hadn't read in a while. So I think it's a really valuable resource. So thank you very much. And that just brings us back to, and we've just mentioned William Butler Yeats is the first poem that we'll discuss, and that's Easter 1916. And if you'd like to maybe read a section of that, and we can have a chat about that afterwards.
Sure. Just to explain that I'm a historian more than a literary scholar. And I've always been fascinated by history, and particularly that period in Ireland in the run-up to and the aftermath to the Easter Rising. So when I started to read Yeats's poetry, I realized that he's a great source for understanding the Ireland of his time. And he has so many what I call history poems, going from No Second Troy up to Meditations in Time of Civil War, and also maybe under Ben Bulben, where he urges us to become the indomitable Irishry, you know, to not to depart from our traditions. So Easter 1916, to my mind, is the greatest public poem of the 20th century in English. And by public poem, I mean a poem that deals with an event that we would now say is part of history, something that created a stir in the wider world, a political event or an event that's historically significant. And, you know, if you were to give someone one thing to read about the Easter Rising, I would recommend Yeats's poem, because it has everything in it. And it has this, you know, the start of it is more descriptive of the people involved and his attitude towards the rising, but then it really steps up a gear in the last two stanzas. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim, and a horse plashes within it. The long-legged moor hens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child when sleep has come at last, on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, not night but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. MacDonagh and MacBride and Connolly and Pearce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.
Oh, wonderful. And what do you think that, those last couple of lines always stick with me? I suppose they're for anybody that any Irish child has studied Easter 1916 in school
Sure.
and beyond. But I suppose those last lines really, strike a chord with so many people. And what do you think that MacDonagh and MacBride and Connolly and Pearse would think of modern Ireland?
Well, I think they'd be astonished, first of all, because it's so different from the Ireland of their time. Anybody really who lived in Ireland or who experienced Ireland, say, in the 19th and early 20th centuries would be amazed at today's Ireland. But the point I want to make about Yeats's poem is that, remember, he wrote this about 4 months after the Rising. So it was very early on.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he got everything more or less right. I mean, at that time in September 1916, when Yeats wrote that poem, the smart money was probably on the parliamentarians from the Irish Party coming back after the war and reasserting their dominance of Irish politics. So the fact that he realized early on that all had changed utterly, shows that he had his finger on the pulse of what was happening in Ireland, more than maybe many politicians had, because some members of the Irish Party probably thought that they would be able to resume their ascendancy in Irish politics, and that didn't happen. And then, if you look at that line, was it needless death after all, for England may keep faith for all that is done and said? That is the first example that I know of revisionism. In other words, people asking questions about the Easter Rising. And again, Yeats asked the question that historians would still be asking today, are still asking today. Was it necessary? Would we have become independent either way, without the Easter Rising and the destruction and death that resulted in, without the executions of the leaders, without the War of Independence, without the Civil War? Could we have avoided all of that and gone in a more gradual, incremental way, step by step, towards independence? And that question is still one that historians debate to this day, and will debate it for generations to come. What do I think myself? No, I mean, my own view is that yes, we might have become independent in a different way through an incremental development of home rule and so on, but it would have been a very different Ireland. And I live in the Ireland, I represent the Ireland, I have done so for the last 42 years, the Ireland that is the child of the Easter Rising. And therefore, for me at least, the Easter Rising was a milestone event in the history and politics of Ireland. And I don't go with the idea that you could simply remove the Easter Rising from the picture and that there'd be no difference in the subsequent evolution of Ireland. I believe that it did set us on a particular path, and that path has led us to where we are today.
Yeah, I would agree. I studied history myself in college, but I would agree in terms of it's central to our modern identity, how we identify as Irish people, and that struggle, I think, is so, and very much you see it in the resulting literature and the culture. I mean,
without the Easter Rising, would we have become Scotland? Would we have become Wales? In other words, different, okay, yeah, having our own parliament and our own identity, but not independent in the way that we are today, and we have been for the last 100 years.
And so is Easter 1916, if a young person or a person who wasn't a poetry lover, for example, because I think sometimes Yeats can be a bit challenging, or because we are taught it in school in Ireland, we can sometimes develop an aversion, if you like, to Yeats. Do you think that Easter 19, like as you said before, is Easter 1916 the first place that you would direct readers, or would there be something else?
No, I think, look, I always say there are two Yeatses. There's the young Yeats and the mature Yeats. I prefer the mature Yeats personally, but many people prefer the young Yeats. And let me give you a story about this. When I was in India in 1982, I think it was, I was friendly with a young Indian woman, and she invited my wife Greta and I, to lunch with her grandmother. And her grandmother, her name was Mrs. Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, and she had been an Indian ambassador to the UN, to the Soviet Union, and to the UK and Ireland. but more perhaps significantly in terms of the history of India, she was the sister of Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the first prime minister of India. And so her family were Indian freedom fighters, if you like. They were involved with, Mahatma Gandhi and so on in the Indian freedom struggle. And then her brother became the prime minister of India for 15 years after independence until his death. And when I met her around her table, she had a large house in a suburb of New Delhi. I sat down at the table. She said, "Oh, you're Irish?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and the small cabin bill there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there a high for the honey bee, and live alone in the Bealout glade." And then she went on to recite, "When you're old and grey and full of sleep and nodding by the fire," and so on. So, and her whole family joined in. And I thought to myself at the time, isn't that amazing? Here we have the most prominent Indian family of the 20th century, and they know the poetry of W.B. Yeats by heart. And I'm sure they could have gone on and recited other poems. So I asked the question, "Mrs. Pandit, where did you learn those poems?" And she said, "When I was interned by the British during our freedom struggle." She said Yeats was a nationalist, and therefore we really responded to him, and we learned those poems. They kept us going when we were in internment, and we've never forgotten them. The whole family knew these poems. Extraordinary. And that, the penny dropped for me at that stage. And I thought, well, hey, if the most famous Indian family of the 20th century knows Irish poetry, I should take it seriously too. And I should learn those poems, which I have, and I often recite them now in different places. So if you want to start on W.B. Yeats, you start with, the Song of Wandering Aengus, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. You start with When You Were Old, with the Lake of Innisfree. The early poems are much more accessible. They're the popular poems by Yeats. But I think Yeats' great achievement was to be a 19th century poet, a bit in the vein of Keats and Shelley and Tennyson and those, and also to be a 20th century poet that could stand alongside T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and W.H. Auden as a modern poet with a modern voice. And that's what you get in East 1916. You get a poet that is thoroughly modern in his language and in the way he approaches poetry, and that he's willing to address issues that are occurring in the wider world and not shirk away from them, as 19th century poets, romantic poets, would have tended to eschew the affairs of the world. And Yeats immersed himself in all things Irish and everything to do with Ireland during his lifetime. He was involved in, and he was a very active person with very good political antennae. And this poem demonstrates more than any other just how plugged in Yeats was to what was happening in Ireland. So I think you start with the early poems, which are more accessible, but later poems, for example, The Second Coming, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart, the centre cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loose, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. That poem has been quoted more often than any poem of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And that's the power of Yeats when he's addressing the affairs of the world. He has a magnificent ability to capture those things brilliantly. And I mean, I recently tweeted some lines from that poem in my daily poetry tweet at Daniel Mulhall. And it had about 50,000 views because people saw it as somehow connected with the affairs, with our predicament today, with the pandemic and the way the world is up in a bit of a heap at the moment. And somehow that poem, written in 1919, actually just during and after the pandemic, the flu pandemic of 1918-19, which almost killed Yeats's wife, and his father, who was in New York at the time, also came down with the flu and was lucky to survive. So the pandemic came very close to Yeats in 1918-19. Now, the poem is not about the pandemic, but I think it's affected in some way by the fact that the world was in a state of, if what Sean O'Casey would say, or might say in June on the Peg, a state of chassis.
Yes, indeed. Wonderful. Well, we'll move on to the next piece that you've chosen, another wonderful Irish poet, Evan Boland, and the Emigrant Irish. And I suppose more than a lot of people, maybe, Ambassador, you have very much experienced the emigrant experience, if you like, having been stationed abroad for so much of your career. Why did you choose this particular poem?
Well, first of all, I got to know Evan Boland when I was in London, because her father Freddie Boland was one of my predecessors. He was ambassador to the UK in the 50s. And because of that, I decided that I would invite Evan Boland to stay with us at the embassy, where she had lived as a girl. She was there for 6 years, between, I think, her 6th and 12th year. So she remembered the embassy, and she was able, when we brought her and we had her stay with us, she was able to recognize her own bedroom and so on, where she'd stayed as a girl for 6 years. Wow. And she gave a reading at the embassy, and we spent a lovely evening and a day with her, and it was a great experience to talk to her. But also, because I have lived with the emigrant Irish in Britain, where much of my work there was connecting with Irish groups all over Britain, visiting Irish centres and so on, and meeting people who are in this category of people who left Ireland in the 60s, 70s, maybe even 50s in some cases, and, you know, made lives for themselves in Britain, but maybe always had a drawback to Ireland, and maybe some of them hoped to retire to Ireland, but maybe didn't manage to do it, and so forth. So I just, the whole experience, and again, in the United States here, you meet people who have that background, who are descended from immigrants who came from Ireland, or even people who've come from Ireland themselves, maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, and are part of American society now, but still have this kind of sense of themselves as being immigrants. So I just feel the whole immigration story is such a big part of Irish identity that this poem means a lot to me. The immigrant Irish. Like oil lamps, we put them out the back of our houses, of our minds. We had lights better than, newer than, and then a time came, this time and now, we need them. Their dread makeshift example. They would have thrived on our necessities. What they survived, we could not even live. By their lights, now it is time to imagine how they stood there, what they stood with, that their possessions may become our power. Cardboard, iron, their hardships parceled in them, patience, fortitude, long suffering in the bruise-colored dusk of the new world, and all the old songs, and nothing to lose. I suppose that's a reminder to us that our predecessors who had to emigrate didn't do so in the way that people might do now. Get onto a plane and you're in your new place in a matter of hours, and you can come back and forth all the time. I mean, people, the younger Irish in Britain these days probably come home, or at least in normal times before the pandemic, would have probably come home 10 times a year for birthdays, anniversaries, parties, whatever. The people who left in the 19th century, most of them never saw their home again. And when you come across those stories, it's really quite poignant to remember just how much previous generations of Irish people went through, because our country in those days, you know, in the 19th century and even in the first half of the 20th century, was not a country that was able to provide people with, or most of our people with, the kind of living that they aspired to, and therefore they had to go abroad. And I just think also those, you know, that final line about all the old songs, you know, and it's true. And this is one of the things I've discovered, is that our culture has traveled and continues to be revered, admired all over the United States, all over the world where there are Irish communities, because that was something that their ancestors brought with them, and it became a treasured possession, and still thrives today. And I go all over America and I come across wonderful musicians, dancers, singers, you name it, who really do immerse themselves in Irish culture, and who really are a credit to Ireland because of the way in which they, you know, they represent our culture in a very vibrant way. And I find that uplifting, to be honest with you. It's one of the things that really makes me, gives me energy, and gives me inspiration when I meet people who may be descended from people who came from Ireland in the 19th century and still feel. I met a woman I was out back in February, one of my last outings before the pandemic. There was an annual dinner of it's called the Emerald Society of the Tidewater. And the Tidewater is where George Washington and Jefferson and Madison all came from. And there was a woman I met there whose family came from Ireland in the 1850s. And she goes back every single year, never misses a year. back in Ireland because she's traced the family, 5th or 6th or 7th cousins in County Monaghan. And her mother, who was 4th generation American, is now buried back in the local graveyard where her predecessors came from. That's the kind of passion and intensity and connection that people feel with Ireland. And it is really wonderful to come across her. Another woman who was showing me around, she was driving me around, showing me some of the sights of the area. And on her mirror, hanging from her mirror, she had her National Library of Ireland card. And I thought, why is that? She said, I'm not entitled to an Irish passport. This is the only way I can display my Irish identity because I'm 4 generations. And there's another person who goes every year to Ireland. You meet people like that who have a passion for us that, you know, is really wonderful. But it's not entirely easy to understand because they are a long way removed from us. But for some reason, usually because their grandparents or great-grandparents inspired them and passed on a love of Irish traditions, that they retain this love to this day, even with all of the changes that have occurred in Ireland and America during this century. For example, this tradition of fondness for Ireland still survives here, and it's a wonderful asset to Ireland because it makes us into a bigger country than we would otherwise be.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a question to ask you, is aside from obviously your family, but is art, like literature and culture, and is that what keeps you most connected to Ireland, do you think?
No, I live in an Irish cocoon here, really. I mean, when you're a diplomat living abroad, you live in 2 countries. You live where you live, and you live in Ireland, because everything I do practically has to do with Ireland. I mean, I don't do anything that's not sort of Irish connected. So if I go to any event, I'm the Irish ambassador. So I can't remove myself from Ireland. So I read the Irish papers every day. I listen to RTE. I follow all the Irish Twitter accounts that keep me informed of what's happening. I'm in touch with Dublin on a daily basis on email and telephone, and now these days Zoom calls more and more. So, I mean, it's not like living abroad, really. It is like you are abroad. You are removed from Ireland. That's true. But you live in this cocoon where everything to do with Ireland is around you all the time. So you never really get any kind of sense of being, removed from you just never get any sense of being removed from Ireland, and you're constantly dealing with Irish things and dealing with Irish people and Irish interests and so on. So this kind of you never get disinherited because your heritage is always there around you all the time.
I think Irish people in general are very adept at that. You know, as somebody who has lived abroad, there's always, when people go abroad, they always gravitate towards the most Irish experience they can have in any given country.
That is true. The number of people here in Washington who gravitate towards the Irish pubs is extraordinary. Yeah. I mean, the Irish pubs are the place where the Irish meet. Yes. And Americans use them as well, of course. But it is interesting that people do want to be with people of their own background, and the Irish seem to have a particular flair in that direction.
Yeah. Moving on to the next chosen poem is a poem, An Irish Lake by W.R. Rogers, which wasn't a poem I was incredibly familiar with. I had come across it previously. Can you tell me why you chose this particular one?
Look, I really like poems that connect the natural world with the world of the affairs of men and women, right? I mean public affairs. And this is a poem in that category. The first verse is a beautiful description of an Irish lake, which could have been written by Yeats or Kavanagh or anyone else. But then the second verse gets down to, you realize that this was written during the Second World War, and the world of war and war's alarms is intruding on him, and he has to go back to the reality of wartime life. But the lake is still that kind of refuge for him away from that. I think that's something that probably all of us have experienced in the last 7 months. Certainly, we spent a huge amount of time in our garden watching the seasons change, because we weren't able to do anything much else, and that we were locked down here for most of the summer, and that we took it very seriously, and we took every precaution to avoid succumbing or to avoid being infected by this terrible virus. So we spent a lot of time in our garden, and the garden became much more meaningful to us than it was, say, last year or the year before, when we also had the same garden. But this year we spent all this time in the garden, and the consolations of nature became very important to us, I'd say. And so we had our binoculars there. We'd sit on the terrace in the evening, and we'd watch the birds landing on, in the garden. We have a little fountain in the garden. They would land there, and we got enormous pleasure from it. And that's the same, I think, with this poem. And I will read it to you. In fact, here it is: An Irish Lake by W.R. Rogers. Rogers was a Presbyterian minister, born in 1909 and died in 1969. So he died really before the Northern Ireland Trouble started. So none of that aspect of our history comes into his work. But it's a fine poem. This is a fine poem. An Irish Lake. There in the hard light, dark birds, pink-footed, dab and pick among the addery roots and marrowy stones. And the blown waves blink and hiccup at the lake's lip. A late bee blares and drones on inland into a cone point of silence. And I, lying at the rhododendron's foot, look through 5 fingers grill at the lake, shaking at the bare and backward plain and the running and bending hills that carry like a conveyor belt a bright snail line of clouds along the sky all day, unendingly. There, far from the slack noose of rumor that tightens into choking fact, I relax, and the sounds and sights and scents sail slowly by. But suddenly, like delicate and tilted italics, the upstanding birds stretch urgently away into the sky, as suddenly grown grey. Night rounds on Europe now, and I must go before its hostile faces peer and pour over the mind's rim enveloping me, and my so frightened thoughts dart here and there like trout among their grim, stony gazes. So there you have, I think, the perfect example of the consolations of nature and then the recognition of the reality of the world around us. And it's important, by the way, there's no point in completely ignoring what's happening around you. There's terrible things happen, but you have to become, you have to be able to cope with the reality of terrible things happening, but at the same time, don't forget about the consolations of nature. And that's what this poem, I think, captures in a wonderful way.
I think that line there, far from the slack noose of rumor that tightens into choking fact, I relax, and sounds and sights and scents sail slowly by. I think that's so absolutely, that encapsulates that.
Well, actually, you would almost think that was a reference to sort of things that you see on Twitter and Facebook, the slack news of rumor that tightens into choking fact. Is not kind of a warning against taking too seriously what you read on social media. Now, he died long before anyone ever thought about social media, but it could almost be a reference to a warning not to take social media too seriously.
Yes, absolutely.
Only take Twitter accounts like mine seriously. The others you can avoid and ignore.
Well, absolutely. I was just going to say that for sure. The next poem, moving on, was a poem, and I just mentioned to you before we went live there that I'm not familiar with this poet, Sarah Berkeley, and in reading it last night, it really resonated with me. And I have had, again, it's about the emigrant experience. It's a poem called Famine Cottages, and I have been an emigrant, but not for any real length of time. But I do have a brother who lives abroad and lives in Canada and has done for a long time. And I suppose this year, I, like many other people, are feeling it more keenly, the fact that we probably won't get to see him in 2020, so it'll be longer than a year. And there were certain lines in this that I had to stop because I thought, I'm going to start crying. Really, this really encapsulates what he must be feeling currently, And Sarah is Irish American?
No, she's Irish. She's from Dublin.
Irish, but has lived in America a long time.
I remember her when she first emerged, and she was seen at that time, probably, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago, maybe. She was seen as the kind of, the brightest star in the firmament of Irish poetry. She was obviously inspired by people like Evan Boland, and, we got more and more women poets coming onto the scene at that time. And she was certainly a big thing at the time. And I think she may have won the Patrick Kavanagh Award, which is one of these awards that tends to give poets a kind of recognition. And then she moved to California. I think she now teaches in Berkeley. She has done so for quite a long time. Yeah. I've never met her, but next time I go to California, whenever that may be, and who knows, I haven't traveled I haven't sat on a plane since early March when I came back from my last visit to Ireland. But no, it's a wonderful poem. I love it because it in a way encapsulates my own life as someone who's lived most of his life away from Ireland. And she refers to various beaches in this poem from her childhood, and I always think of Dunmore and Woodstown and Tramore and Anstown and so on. So whenever I follow a lot of Waterford Twitter accounts. Whenever I see a photograph of Dunmore, it always takes me back to, you know, my. In fact, I have a painting of Dunmore in my bedroom, which always kind of, you know, reminds me of my childhood and the various times the family spent in Woodstown and Dunmore in particular, which were the favourites of my parents, Tom and Alice. So this is Famine Cottages, and it's all about visiting a former famine village, and then the thoughts that this applies to. The horses move across the top of the hill. The water's still a stone below. If I had to let it all in, the places where I feel at home, I'm certain it would take me down. I would be undone. I'd drown. As it is, there is little purchase on my surface, few ways in. The trees send up their prayers for rain. The hills colour up at the mention of spring. This year, I've been more than half my life elsewhere. For so long, I have been other, insular, foreigner, with the buried idiom. Across the reservoir, deer paths lace the hillside. In my pocket, 2 stones and a shell from the beach below the Famine Cottages at Rossown. We used to row there in a skiff, late night. Last night, the driving California rain drove home to me how far away those beaches where we played as kids, Dogs Bay, Inch, Carsiveen, the dry stone walls squaring off their handkerchiefs of land. New Year's Eve, 1993, I flew across an ocean and 6,000 miles to be where I am now. And this is how I've lived my adult life, away from my original home, in a new place with new people, and about face from all I'd known. This is what I chose: the airport departure halls, the agonized farewells, and now these hills, my northern moon, my pre-dawn birds. So what she's really saying there, in my view, is she's saying, okay, she aches for her memories, her childhood memories in Ireland, but she's also got consolations. And the consolations are, the California that she lives in, the pre-dawn birds and so on. So, and that's how you have to be if you live abroad. You can't be pining away for home all the time. Otherwise, you shouldn't be where you are. You should be at home. At the same time, you need to maintain that connection with home, in my view, in order to be a complete person. So you've got to recognize the pluses and minuses of being abroad. And there are many minuses. You're away from family. And I'm like Sarah Berkeley in this poem, I spent more than half my adult life abroad. And I have missed a lot of things, family occasions and so forth. Both my parents passed away when I was, away on diplomatic service, had to, rush home for their funerals. So there's a sadness there that you can't get away from. And, you also lose contact with friends. But you do also experience things, and you have to kind of put the two of those things, the negative and the positive, in the same weighing scales and weigh it up and decide whether, the life you live is the one you want to live. And that's the life that I've chosen to live. So I have no regrets, but I do recognize the downsides as well as the upsides. But you have to always, in Washington, the pre-dawn birds, well, the birds in my fountain outside, which I'll probably see this afternoon, being able to walk around, being able to visit the Capitol, and visit congressmen and senators and so on. That's what gives you the lift and the buzz, and it compensates for what you lose by being away from home and family.
And for me, I think as a kind of an immigrant at certain points in my life, I was never able to balance that. The draw of home, surprisingly almost to me, I always felt the thought of being away from home was more desirable than the actual fact of it for me personally. And I always came home, and I would when abroad, I would become morosely obsessed with Irish things, and I was never able to reconcile that myself. I was always drawn home. But it has to be, and like that, as I said, my brother lives abroad, and you can see that he lives in Toronto, which is beautiful, and he has to balance that all the time, and has a great life in Canada, and that's the balance there of what is life.
Every Irish immigrant has had to do for generations past. They have had to kind of, now it's easier today, with
Yeah.
communications. I went to India, for example, in 1980. I didn't speak to my family for a full year. You couldn't phone home. When our daughter Tara was born in 1982, I had to send a telegram home because I booked a call, but it never came through. So it is easier now to maintain contact. I mean, we're on to our children or our grandchildren every day on FaceTime.
Yeah. And in
But,
this particular
but it's
piece,
different, you know. It's
yeah,
different now.
in this
It's connection at home.
this piece, I suppose one of the things that struck home for me was that sense of otherness sometimes for immigrants, that they're, and I previously when I lived in New York, I spoke to a lot of Irish Americans Irish people who had moved to America, but maybe in the 40s and 50s, and they were never fully American, nor were they fully Irish, and they were caught in this kind of identity crisis, if you like, a kind of a lack of belonging. Have you experienced or spoken to people that have felt like that?
Well, I think Sarah Berkeley talks about the buried idiom. In other words, that you have to kind of bury some of your idioms. For example, you can't talk about crack. You can't talk about the crack here in America because people would think you're talking about crack cocaine or something, and that would not be a subject of a conversation in circles I move in. So you have to kind of be careful in what you say. Now, there's not that many of those things, and you quickly learn the things that you have to kind of avoid. But yes, I mean, you do meet people who are permanently unhappy because they're neither here nor there, as I think we'll come to in a poem I'm going to read in a little while, Shemasini's Postscript. So in other words, there are people who do never kind of quite reconcile themselves. I mean, I met people, in Britain who really didn't like living there, but had lived there for all their lives. And I think that's a terrible tragedy. You don't meet so many people in America like that because people, when you move here, people do make the difference between Britain and America is that people go to Britain just to go to Britain to work. They don't consciously think they're emigrating. Whereas if you go to America, there's a kind of a move you're making. If you get a green card, for example, these days, you're making a decision. Now, you don't have to stay there, but you're making a kind of a definite decision. Whereas, Irish people younger people who move to Britain, move to London for a few years, they're not really emigrating in the sense that people did in the past, because they're quite likely to come home, or some of them at least are. It's a different story from the one we had in the past. So I think the difference really is that today Irish people, when they go abroad, they're going abroad in a different way from how their predecessors went. And Sarah Berkeley is obviously an example of someone. She didn't have to, do rough work on building sites as many Irish men had to do, or work in in bars and restaurants to make a living. Which you make a very good living on here, by the way, with the tip culture that exists in America.
Yeah,
but anyway,
done it. Yeah.
but obviously she's not. She went there, to teach in a famous American university, which is a different story. And that's the story of Ireland today. And I'm delighted about that, by the way. I'm delighted to see that, because the stories I heard from Irish people who went across to Britain, and some of them I met in their 80s and 90s, and they went across in the 50s and 60s. It was not a pleasant experience, because Irish people were not made that welcome. And now, of course, the Irish are the flavour of the month in Britain, because they add greatly to Britain's economic life, because they're so well qualified, and they're all working for the most significant and successful companies in Britain. So it's a wholly different ball game now from the kind of experience that Ivan Boland wrote about. I mean, I think that the experience that Sarah Berkeley writes about, of kind of yearning for home, but yet seeing the consolations of where you live, that's more the norm these days, rather than the kind of sentimental pull to Ireland, which made people in the past unable to settle in the place where they were going to spend their lives.
Absolutely. And we're going to move back to kind of more home turf, if you like, Waterford, and look at a poem by Sean Dunn, which you have a very particular connection to, obviously, and you can explain that in a moment. And Sean is, one of the most celebrated contemporary Irish poets, I guess, and we're very proud of him in Waterford. In fact, the first iteration of this festival was called the Sean Dunn Festival. Tell us a little bit about this poem.
Well, Sean was at school with me. He was a year behind me in Mount Sion, but we knew each other well, and we had this little circle of people who were interested in poetry and literature. We had a very inspirational teacher at the time, Sean Crowe. I'm sure many people on this call will probably know Sean. He still lives in Waterford, I believe, but he was a great inspiration to all of us. He encouraged us to read beyond the curriculum and gave us a sense of the possibilities of literature and its power to affect our lives. And Sean and I then teamed up in college. We lived in the same area. We saw each other quite a lot, and even after college, he would come to Dublin. He would sometimes stay with us, and we'd have dinner together. And so we were very friendly. And until Sean sadly passed away, I had the sad task of going to his funeral in Ballyvorney there many years ago. He was really developing into a very powerful writer. And I think Waterford and the world actually was deprived of a really great talent. But when I decided to get married, I met my wife Greta in New Delhi. She was an Australian diplomat, so we decided to get married there. And my family, my mum and dad, and my aunt Kathleen was still in Waterford, living in Griffith Place, and my sister Louise, who now lives in Tramore. They came out for the wedding, and four of my wife's family came as well from Australia. So we had a great gathering and so on. And I invited a lot of my friends from Ireland to the wedding. I mean, obviously, I kind of knew that none of them would come, because in those days, traveling to India was a big deal indeed for people who didn't have, just starting out in their careers and didn't have much money. But Sean sent us a poem called "A Wedding Letter to New Delhi." And I'll just read the last. And basically, he describes the scene. Now, it's not an exact description, of course, but it's evocative of what Delhi was like, because I think I'd written some letters to him and told him about what life was like in Delhi. But the last few lines are, the last few verses are I think powerful, and it's written in the form of an epithalamium, like Spenser's epithalamium, a wedding poem. I live in the wrong time to fill songs with pale nymphs who surround you singing "Ayo, ayo, Hymen, ayo," or to talk of forests where minstrels with pipes and tabors play to celebrate your act. I offer what I see from my high window, the still city walls where shredded posters catch the rain, doors open in flats along Wellington Road where sports results cackle across corridors. Does this depiction of the real depress your gay spirits on this your wedding day? Still I claim, in such crude pictures lies our proper place, that the torn paper trapped in a pool or the squeak of an unoiled bicycle after dark contain more wonder at the being alive than the pine for chorus-haunted wood that conjured Orpheus with impossible lute. With that, I saw two swans of godly hue come softly swimming down along the lee, their gaze fixed on the current's flow, necks curled against dismal showers. Around them, cranes turn above anchored ships, and in their perfect poise I find your match, a measured pace, oriental in its calm, from here to Delhi, let their echoes ring. So there you have a sort of an assertion that the everyday things of life are just as powerful, or maybe more powerful for us, than the kind of pine for chorus-haunted woods of Spenser's and older poets. So basically, he's essentially saying, celebrate the things around you and don't be pining for things that you can't really replicate, because the world has moved on, and the world is still a wonderful place, but it's populated in a different way, and it has different features now from the ones that Spenser was able to celebrate during the Elizabethan age.
Yeah, I love that poem. What a wonderful thing to have, and the line, as a former resident of Wellington Road, the line, doors open and flats along Wellington Road where sports results crackle across corridors. That's so evocative of a place and a time. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah. No, and in fact, he sent us. We have in our wedding album, we have the original manuscript of that poem.
Wow.
So it's a little heirloom for us that we treasure. Yeah. And
you spoke about you're a teacher in school, and I was mentioning to you, this is almost like the alumni of Mount Sinai a little bit for Waterford Writers Weekend. He obviously had a huge impact on you as young men, and I know that you're an author yourself, but do you take any solace in writing, or do you enjoy it for pleasure?
I mean, I've never been able to write a proper poem. I have made several deposits in the Doggerel Bank, but you know, I mean, I can write a poem for, you know, a birthday or whatever, but it's never a proper poem. It's more a little rhyme or whatever. I've never been able to write. I remember once I come up with a line that Sean really liked, which was, "I had a bowl of scruples." I don't know. I mean, he liked that line, but I was never able to find the second line for it, so I had to give it up. But I mean, I tried a few times writing poems and realized I didn't have a talent for. I think to be a poet, you need a gift. You need a particular gift for poetry, for the inspiration and for crafting the words in ways. I mean, my favorite, what I do best is the 1,000-word essay. I mean, if you ask me to do an essay on any subject, 1,000 words, I'll produce a serviceable essay that will be publishable. So I like blogs. I do a blog now. In fact, I'm doing a James Joyce blog, a Ulysses blog. I'm currently on episode 14 of Ulysses, and I'm hoping to finish it before the end of the year and to publish the blogs as a book next year in advance of the centenary of the publication of Ulysses in 2022. So that kind of thing, a blog, 1,000 or 1,500 word blog, that's really where I think I shine as a, you know, and I really do enjoy it. I mean, obviously I write a lot of stuff for official purposes, which is one thing, but it's a different way of writing in a way. But I like to sit down and do blogs and do essays of various kinds. I've been invited to deliver a keynote lecture on Yeats at the National Library in December, and I've been invited by the Home Place to deliver a keynote lecture to mark the 25th anniversary of Seamus Heaney's Nobel Prize. That's been done in next month. I think, in December, to mark the anniversary of Heaney's Nobel Prize. And I was actually involved in that in various ways because it was a hilarious story. But Tommy Gorman from RTE was a great friend of mine from my time in Brussels, and he was the European correspondent in those days. Now he's in Northern Ireland, but he's a great guy and really great friend. And when Heaney got the prize, Tommy rang me and said, "Dan, can you track down Heaney for me? I believe he's in Greece." And I said, "Well, Tommy, what can I do?" But anyway, I spent a whole day ringing people at the embassy in Athens to find out where he might be. And eventually, I was actually playing golf, believe it or not. And Tommy rang me to say he'd found Heaney and he was on the way home. Could I arrange a ceremony for his arrival? So from the golf course, I managed to speak to people in Aer Lingus at Dublin Airport, and I spoke to the president's office and got the president to agree to meet Heaney on his return from Greece as the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. So I have this kind of connection with the with Heaney's Nobel Prize. So I'm delighted to have been invited to give a lecture on Heaney at the Home Place in December to mark that great anniversary.
Wow, this brings us nicely to the final poem that you've chosen, and obviously quite apt. It's Postscript. Why this particular Heaney poem?
Well, because I just think it's a fine poem. It's a short poem, very powerful, and the lines, "You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass," I think captures something that only a poet like Heaney could capture about the human condition. Let me tell you a story about this poem. Because of my daily poetry tweets, the American Academy of Poets invited me to do a reading of some poems at the Lincoln Center in New York, in the Alice Tully room, with 2,000 people attending. This is their big annual fundraiser for poetry for their organization, and they give out bursaries, and people pay a fortune to go to these things. Of course, that's the way America works with philanthropy. So I was invited to read some poetry, and I read some Yeats. I read some Irish American poets, and I finished off with Postscript. And when I finished the poem, I could hear people gasping with joy and astonishment at the kind of final lines of the poem. And afterwards, people came up to me and told me what a wonderful experience it was to listen to the Heaney poem in particular. So it was the one poem that really hit the spot. on that occasion, which convinced me that this is a poem of genuine quality, because when people can respond to it, I haven't read it before, in 2,000 person auditorium, when they respond like that with a kind of a gasp, you know this is a poem that hits the spot. And here it is.
Absolutely.
Postscript. And sometime, make the time to drive out west into County Clare along the flaggy shore, in September or October, when the wind and the light are working off each other, so that the ocean on one side is wild with foam and glitter, and inland among stones, the surface of a slate grey lake is lit by the earthed lightning of a flock of swans, their feathers ruffed and ruffling white on white, their fully grown, headstrong-looking heads tucked or cresting or busy underwater. Useless to think you'll park and capture it more thoroughly. You are neither here nor there. A hurry through which known and strange things pass. As big, soft buffetings come at the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open. I think those last lines are among the best lines that Heaney has written. I could have chosen The Curate Troy, you know, making hope and history rhyme, which is one of the other poems that is most frequently quoted, including by presidential candidates and senators and presidents and so forth in the United States.
Yeah, well, I was just going to mention that he seems to be invoked by a lot of political people at the moment. Why do you think? Yeah, I suppose with he, and I love Seamus Heaney myself. My favorite Heaney poem myself is Scaffolding, but why do you think he resonates so fully, and not just with Irish people? I mean, across the world, there is a connection that we have to and like you said, it's a physical reaction that people get to his poetry. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, because he was a great character as well as a great poet, and I think he made a big impression here in America. A lot of people knew him well and admired him. I launched this book, 100 poems, for the Heaney family last year, and Mary and the whole family came over, and we had a great couple of days with them. It's really a marvelous event. We got a great response, and you know, for example, the day after the launch, a friend of ours here, Joe Hassett, who's a great lawyer and also a Yeats and Joyce scholar, and Joe organized a lunch for the Heaney family, and the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, one of the 9 members of the Supreme Court, and his wife came along to this lunch.
Wow.
Because that's the kind of reach that Heaney had. They knew the Heaney family. They knew Heaney. So he was really a great ambassador for Ireland. I always loved meeting him. I first met him in Edinburgh when I was Consul General there, and he spoke at the Edinburgh Festival, I think it was, and we had a few events with him. And it was wonderful just to be in his company. And I've been looking forward, because when I moved to London, I knew from my predecessor that Seamus was a regular visitor, and he used to stay at the embassy sometimes. And I was looking forward to being his host. And then he died about a month before I arrived in fact, about a couple of weeks before I arrived in London. So I was deprived of that opportunity to get to know him even better during my time in London. But he was a great poet, is a great poet, and his poems will live on. I think after Yeats, he's probably our greatest modern poet, and I think his work will really live on. And his work tells a story about Ireland as well, because he tells a story of the Ireland of his day, just as Yeats told a story about. And I also like the fact that Heaney himself didn't shy away from the events of his time, from the troubles in Northern Ireland, which he addressed in many of his poems, both directly and obliquely. But it's a wonderful body of work, which I think will live on and will be part of the Irish literary canon for as long into the future as I can imagine.
And what a wonderful way to end this conversation. I would happily sit here and talk poetry with you for the rest of the day, but I know you probably have more.
I have other things I might have to do today. I have to bring a few politicians and talk about the election, perhaps. There you are.
Oh God, okay. Rather you than me.
I don't. The problem these days is that, of course, there are no big events on. So in a normal year, an election year, I would have been at the Democratic National Convention in Milwaukee, Republican National Convention in Charlotte. I would have gone to, the first debate at the University of Notre Dame, because I have good connections there. It's a very Irish place. I would have been out on the campaign. I would have probably done a day following Joe Biden and a day following President Trump, and I would have really got to meet people and so on. And unfortunately, that hasn't been possible this time around, because there are not these events. I mean, I just wouldn't go to those events because it would be reckless, and it would be, I mean, basically my my philosophy here is I won't do anything in America that wouldn't be allowed in Ireland, because I believe that we're getting it right in terms of prioritizing public health. Unfortunately, here it's a bit more of a mixed situation, because there's a lot of resistance to the measures that the health experts believe are necessary. But I've been deprived of that opportunity to have conversations with people, and I haven't been at an event for 7 months now, and probably won't be at a big event for another number of months until the virus comes under control and so on. But it's email and Zoom calls and virtual events and phone calls to people have had to compensate for not being able to get out and about and talk to people. But I still manage to keep close tabs on what's happening. And of course, there's a big debate this evening, which we'll all be glued to. That's the last big event of the campaign season. And then, of course, we have the election in less than 2 weeks' time, and the whole country really. It's amazing here that because the presidential election is so important, it does captivate attention in a way that you don't see in most other countries. I mean, we have elections which are important. They don't quite have the same, they don't generate the same obsessions as the presidential election does here, because the stakes are so high, because the president's such a powerful figure and he has a global role which is second to none, really. So it's fascinating to observe. I've been observing American elections for 60 years. The first one I remember following with my father on RTE back in '68 was the election where the year that Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated, and you had Nixon against Hubert Humphrey, and that was a very big sort of year with lots of student demonstrations and what have you. And this year has been very similar, but at least I've been able to watch this from America, even though I haven't been able to go out on the campaign trail, which has been a shame. But there you are. You got to make do with. I mean, everyone's got to adjust their lifestyles these days.
And
I know that people have gone into level 5 lockdown now all over Ireland, and I do earnestly hope that this will succeed in bringing the virus down to levels where a more normal version of life can be resumed in December. I keep my fingers crossed. You're in my prayers and thoughts.
Thank you so much, and we were so honoured to have you join us for Waterford Writers Weekend this year, and hopefully we will get to see you in person, perhaps at a future festival. One of these days. Thank you so much.
I will be back. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Ambassador Daniel Mulhall, thank you.
You're welcome. Take care. Thanks. Bye.